Erick Jose Ramirez is our first speaker. Erick is Associate Professor at Santa Clara University. He's a specialist in moral psychology in all of its forms, and has recently been working on various interdisciplinary issues in the ethics of developing and using virtual reality technologies. Erick's talk today is entitled Extended Reality Embodiment and the Complicated Future of Selves. So why don't you share your screen, Erick? Got about 40 minutes, and I'll send you a private message with a warning 5 minutes before the end of that, so we can make sure we keep to time. Okay.
Great, thank you. I'll try to make sure I keep to time, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So I think I'm going to try in this talk. I hope to do both of the things, Ben, that you mentioned, which is to talk about some opportunities here, but also some potential risks. And you will definitely see instances of the Mills trap in some of this conversation. And so, you know, I lead we call it the experimental philosophy lab over at Santa Clara, but it's a very small room with some virtual reality devices. And we've been doing a lot of work on different aspects of extended reality. So today I'm going to be talking specifically about what I'm calling extended reality embodiment, and how that introduces, as I just said, some potential for really interesting new ways of self-expression, but also I think some fairly pressing concerns about regulation, control, representation, and so on. And so some of these issues really were born in the kind of last couple of chapters of the book that I published last year with Routledge, but in a lot of ways, we've been extending these ideas about especially augmented reality embodiment in the last sort of year and a half. And so I wanted to start the talk today just by defining these particular terms. What do I mean by physical embodiment? What do I mean by extended reality embodiment? And how are these connected to senses of identification in such a way? So I hope to convince you, even though we are quite early days in terms of others who are doing research on the psychology of embodiment in these spaces, that there's enough evidence to think that individuals can identify with both elements of extended reality and physical bodies, that's something that should be of interest to philosophers, especially who are interested in harm mitigation, right? And so if I can convince you of that, then I'm going to introduce a few problems or a few issues that I think need our attention. One is really obvious. It's going to be about control and representation of extended reality embodiment. Throughout the talk, unfortunately, I won't be offering answers. In fact, maybe what I'm doing is offering too many answers. There are a lot of options here for how we choose to settle these issues, and I think each one will have a series of trade-offs. And it's not clear exactly which ones and how and why we should choose. But in terms of issues over control, in terms of issues over re-identification, meaning, unless the metaverse or these social extended reality spaces end up being controlled by a single corporation or a single state, we're going to move between these spaces. And we're going to want ways of making sure that the people that I identify in one space are the same people that I identify in another space. But that becomes complicated because XR embodiment just is so different from physical embodiment. And I'll survey some options there. And if we care, which it looks like people really do, in terms of knowing whether the individual agents I'm working with and dealing with are human or merely human-like, then that's going to introduce another set of questions that I think we need some answers to. And in some ways, ChatGPT and other large language models have made this an especially pressing issue. When we were first seeking to write this, when we first wrote some of these papers and chapters, we talked about this issue as being the most distant, sort of the most abstract and oblique problem, and that's just become just false. I think it's just become false as the most distant. And so when I talk about physical embodiment, I'm talking about the experience you're all having now, right? And so we all have a sense of what it is, whatever you think the self is. This is really more psychology than metaphysics. So whatever you think the self is and its relationship to your form of physical embodiment, right? The body that you are currently in anyway. And one thing that's interesting about human beings is there are very few human universals. One thing that does seem true about humans in different times and different places is that we will use the tools around us at that time and place, the technology around us, to modify the body for forms of self-expression, right? And these modifications can be quite mild, right? We can develop textiles and use them in different ways to overlay onto our physical bodies to express ourselves. We can crush up different things to make pigments and put them on our bodies. We can use tattoos, we can use piercings and so on. The modifications can be mild, they can be larger. But what's interesting about physical embodiment is that there are limits to it. In other words, there's only so much you can kind of push and pull and stretch the biological form before it ceases to function, right? So there are just limitations built into how far we can take the human body as a medium for the expression of the self through it. When I talk about extended reality embodiment, I'm talking about a similar sort of experience. It's the experience of self as it's grounded in the relationship between the self and one's virtual bodies. And virtual bodies, really, it's extended reality. So it's anything that across the entire spectrum of extended reality. It can be as mild as artificial intelligence, just a sort of filter technology that can change our appearance. Right. So these are all same person, different AI filter overlays that are changing in some ways quite dramatically the way she presents. This would be one form of extended reality embodiment in her case. If you've ever taken a photo and applied a layer to it, even if it's just a bump up saturation, for me, this is a form of a relatively mild form of extended reality embodiment. But if you've seen commercials for Horizon, right, you've seen other forms of extended reality embodiment. So this is Mark Zuckerberg creating his extended reality body here. In his case, he's creating a form of embodiment that has some similarity to his physical body. It's not identical because it is thinner and younger looking than him, right? But it bears a relation to him. Unlike physical embodiment, extended reality embodiment doesn't have that limitation, though. This is from the same promotional material for Horizon Worlds, right? Or Horizon, as they call it now. Extended reality bodies really can be almost anything. They're not limited in terms of how we can stretch and pull and modify for forms of self-expression. You could be a color changing cloud of mist even, right? Which we just can't do with physical bodies and keep them intact. What's interesting to me about this new world that people are stepping into, where we have these forms of embodiment, is that they can come into conflict. And those conflicts in some cases can generate things like dysphoria. So what is this article 2020? What were we doing in 2020? We were doing kind of what we're doing now, except a lot more intensely, right? We were spending a lot of time mediated through technology, interacting with each other. Sometimes, so Snapchat dysphoria is this kind of proposed modification of body dysmorphic disorder or a subtype of body dysmorphic disorder. Sometimes it's called Zoom dysphoria. And the idea here is, by the way, Zoom, right, has improved my appearance features. In fact, you are viewing me through them right now. I am using them. And so as people became very accustomed to viewing themselves through these mild forms of extended reality embodiment, they were feeling a mismatch, right? A conflict between the extended reality form of embodiment, physical form of embodiment, and that conflict generates dysphoria. It's really interesting how these conflicts can arise. There's this, if you are looking for other individuals to invite, Guo Freeman at Clemson has just been doing really interesting research on this form of embodiment. She does a lot of research in extended reality, social virtual reality experiences. And so this is from one of her studies. I'm going to quote it again in the next slide. And I think this particular subject in her study is getting at the idea that I want to get at here, which is in real life, you're stuck with what you're born with. In other words, physical embodiment has limits built into it. But I would say extended reality, but in virtual reality, you can be what you truly feel like you are inside. So you can use this new form of embodiment as a form of self-expression, and a real one, meaning you can identify with it in a strong way, that this conflict can be settled in favor of extended reality embodiment. Now, this doesn't always happen, right? So if you're a gamer, you are embodied in all sorts of things, all sorts of bodies that don't necessarily create this relation. So it looks like, this is just another quote from one of her other subjects in this embodiment study. Rec Room is a social VR application. With Rec Room, when you're creating the avatar, you're actually looking at it, and you can move around and turn around. It's truly an extension of you. If it's in a normal game, it's not as engaged. I'll just find the first thing that looked kind of okay and go with it. So with games, especially that are fixed purpose, fixed function, and where users are embodied in fairly straight, like a fairly narrow range of bodies, you don't really get this identification. In Freeman's study, this is not an image from her study. In Freeman's study, what they did was allow people actually many degrees of freedom and customization and design of their avatars, but also full body tracking. And it was that sort of open-ended function and the full body tracking that seemed to generate these strong identification feelings with extended reality bodies. And in her case, one thing that I thought was really interesting about some of the results that she got was 2 of her subjects actually ended up having a really transformative experience in it that is demonstrative of what I'm trying to get at here with extended reality embodiment. So both of them ended up making some decisions about their physical bodies as a result of the identification with their extended reality bodies. So I'm just going to quickly read that. Using a feminine avatar makes me confident not only in VR, but also in real life. I feel like that would be actually more real than the real you in real life. This is the quote I just read, because in real life, you're stuck with what you're born with, but in VR, you can be what you truly feel like you are inside. This experience actually gave me confidence to start my transgender procedure in real life. So although they're talking about VR, in some ways, it's even easier with augmented reality, right? You get the full body tracking for free if we're just doing overlays onto physical forms. Similarly, another subject had the same kind of experience, and here they put it, I think, especially sharply. By using a feminine female avatar, I found that I was just more comfortable with that body. And it's kind of what I learned about my identity. That was the evidence to myself to consider which direction I wanted to take my actual body outside of VR. If I found I was happy in VR about my body and I was not happy with my body outside of VR, why not change it? So here again, we're getting 2 different forms of embodiment, right? The sort of extended reality body, the physical body, and conflict being generated in terms of identity between these 2 forms of embodiment being settled in favor of the extended reality body. Again, early days, so I don't know exactly how common this feature will be, but it does look like you can generate conditions under which people will feel quite strong an identification with extended reality bodies, extended reality overlays, right, cosmetic improvement filters and so on as preferred forms of embodiment. And if that's true, then we get some issues. We get some issues that I think need more attention than people are giving them, and more attention and maybe more creativity than I have to resolve them. The very first one is the one I mentioned earlier. It's about control. So if embodiment really is something that is of significant importance to people's sense of self and to their sense of identity and form of self-expression, then control over these bodies is going to be important. And here's, I think, where the kind of Mills trap idea will come in, right? Because the ideas that exist right now are just trying to import norms from other spheres and put them into this space, but they don't work very well. So I think the most obvious answer is that we should take the norms that govern physical bodies and import them into these social extended reality spaces. In physical spaces, I chose to present myself this way to you today. You chose to present yourselves in this way for us today. I don't get to control that. You control it. I can turn off the screen, I suppose, right? I can look away, but I can't determine your embodiment. And so one particular answer to this question about control is that users should just be able to control their own embodiment in any which way, right? For others. Treat it, in other words, like a purely physical space. One issue with that is that XR embodiment is not physical embodiment. The degrees of freedom with XR embodiment mean that users can engage in harassment that is impossible really with physical bodies. So this is just a sort of toy example, right? But it's very easy, in other words, to radically alter your appearance in ways that are just built to offend or insult someone. If, for example, I know that somebody has been in an abusive relationship, I can embody myself as their abuser, right? I can't do that with my physical form of embodiment. So just purely importing the norms for physical embodiment into these social extended reality spaces is going to settle some issues, but it's going to create new problems that we don't really have a framework for resolving. Another answer is to import norms from social media spaces instead of physical spaces. in social media spaces, users actually have a lot of control over their environment and how it appears to them. You can block users, right? Who appears in your feeds and so on is really something you can curate. And so importing these norms would solve some of these problems, right? If I can choose to block users so that they're invisible to me in these spaces, or if I can choose to control the embodiment of other users to avoid being offended or insulted in the ways I was just describing, then that really would settle some of the problems. But again, it creates other issues. On the one hand, it takes away something that really does seem important to us, which is the use of our bodies for self-expression, right? It gives it to somebody else. But it also has some really strange implications. So what's Agent Smith doing here? This is a stand-in for a form of digital erasure that I think is possible with this option. If I am a committed sort of ethno-nationalist of some kind, right? And I have control over other people's embodiment, then I can choose to view them as just whatever I want, right? I can choose to view them as all being members of my preferred ethnic or racial identity and digitally erase them in this way, right? Digitally erase the forms of diversity that they may value. As other technologies like deepfake technology mature and improve, it would become very easy to view others in ways they would not consent to being viewed by, right? If I control their embodiment. I wouldn't need to imagine people in their underwear when I'm nervous giving a speech, right? I could just literally view them this way. And that too seems like a cost that extended reality embodiment imposes onto these situations that physical embodiment doesn't. And so you might also think, well, there are other ways of solving these problems, right? We could also just let the corporations figure it out. I think you've probably had discussions about this already. But corporations, in some ways, corporations would solve some of these problems. They would not want to create a user environment that is so toxic that that users are driven away from the platform. So they would engage in some kinds of moderation that would solve these problems. This is just an image from The Sims where you get customization options that are in some ways kind of limited. But as many people have written, I'm drawing specifically from Luciano Floridi when he's talking about content moderation, but content moderation in terms of service violations are not something, corporations are not explicitly committed to things like procedural justice or fairness, right? And so how they apply their own moderation policies is not going to be equitable to different users. Users that drive people to the platform are going to be given a lighter touch than users that don't. And so if you allow corporations to control embodiment, again, that solves some issues, but it creates others. States, at least nominally, liberal democratic states are committed to things like procedural justice. And so you would want states to have a say here. And in fact, you can't really do any of the first two options without involving states or corporations. But this is the obvious Black Mirror problem, right? This is the Charlie Brooker example of, if you've seen the Christmas special, you know what's happening here. This is a world actually where everybody has an augmented reality layer and exists in it. And so if states empowered with control over embodiment really do have a potential for abusing that power that we may not want them to exercise. Imagine, for example, if we already lived in an omnipresent augmented reality layer, it would be impossible to have the kinds of protests we had in Iran, for example, with headscarves, because states could just digitally put headscarves on people, right? It would be impossible to use the body as a form of protest, as a form of expression, if states can control it. So it's a risk of empowering states in this way, in other words. I don't know what the answer is to issue one here, but I do think if extended reality bodies matter in the way that they seem to matter, then as we begin to exist in a world where we use these bodies as forms of expression more and more, we're going to need some answer to this question about control and representation. A second question, it's related, but not identical. It has to do with re-identification. Re-identification is cheap and easy in physical spaces because we evolved to do it. It's important for us to keep track of people who cooperate with us, to keep track of people who don't cooperate with us, because we want to engage with or not engage with them in the future. It can be kind of controversial depending on who's in the room, right? Whether you think things like the fusiform face gyrus evolved to keep track of faces specifically, or evolved to do some other things, and it can also do faces. But it looks like we're really, really tuned to, for example, pay special attention to facial geometry, the psychology of re-identification. It looks really interesting. You can re-identify people just by looking at silhouettes of their movement, right? The way they move their bodies seems to be something we can pick up and identify them with. There's some really weird studies about olfaction, that you can recognize people by their sense of smell. You're not exactly sure why you know it's this person, but you're better than random at guessing that it is a certain person. Voice recognition, similarly, we can recognize people by the sounds of their voices. So these are features tied to physical embodiment. And the problem is, extended reality embodiment isn't tied to these features. They can vary from instance to instance, right? In fact, that's kind of their selling point, is that you can vary from instance to instance. And so re-identification becomes difficult. We need what I'm calling here sticky and stable properties to do this. Sticky properties are just properties that can reliably pick out individuals. Stable properties are properties we can reliably track. And so if you think, for example, black hair is a stable property. I can track black hair as it moves around a room. I can track black hair in lots of different contexts, but it's not sticky. People can change their hair color. People can cut their hair completely. It's not going to pick out an individual person. In other words, you need a property that can do both. And ideally, you need a property that can do both without requiring a large scale surveillance state, right, that keeps track of these identity properties across the metaverse, purely for, I think, the kinds of privacy issues you've already discussed. And maybe even without a corporate surveillance state. If you can avoid creating either of those while maintaining some system for re-identification across metaverse spaces, then that would be ideal. And so what I want to do is just very quickly survey some of those options. How might we re-identify people? How might we ensure that, so Ben, I've got you on my screen here. You're the only person I can see right now. So how do I know that the Ben Colburn I can see right now, let's say we meet again, is the same Ben Colburn? You look similarly, but how do I know it's you, right, in these spaces? I think one really obvious answer is that we should use biomarkers, right? Some of us already do this. Maybe you unlock your phone with your fingerprint. Maybe you unlock your computer with your facial scan or something. Biomarkers seem really well suited to do this task. They are sticky and stable. It's very difficult to change at least biomarkers that are unique to you. But biomarkers introduce a couple of problems. One, I mean, it requires a pretty invasive surveillance apparatus, right? We need some central repository of biomarkers that Meta can check in with to make sure that it's me, that, let's say, Sony has a space that Sony can check in with to make sure that it's me, and so on. You need some kind of repository of biomarker data that is just a serious privacy concern, right? That data can be released accidentally or intentionally in ways that are harmful. Another potential cost of biomarkers, and this I want to be careful with how I express it. Another potential cost of biomarkers is that biomarkers make a fairly rigid claim about the connection between the self and the body. And if possible, we want to avoid picking an answer today that may seem regressive in the future 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If you are aware of transhumanist movements, right? Transhumanists believe that we ought to use technology to modify the body in all sorts of ways. In some cases, the body is completely inessential to who you are as a person. Transhumanists who believe, for example, in sort of substrate independence. Now I'm thinking specifically of Nick Bostrom, who think that you really can be uploaded to a computer, right? That only makes sense if you think the body is inessential to your identity. Other trans movements that are really controversial in the moment, right? So transracialism, transableism, I'm bringing them up here not to side in a particular way about whether they're socially valid or invalid identity categories, but to point out that we live in a moment where the relation between the self and the body, the unmodified or natal body, is a really controversial relation. And so biomarkers have as a drawback settling that conflict in a very particular way, right? By identifying the self with a body marker that one doesn't have control over or choose. If we can avoid relying on something like that while answering this issue, I think that's an advantage. And so we started to explore some other options here. If it's not biomarkers, what could it be? Maybe it's NFTs. Maybe NFTs can do this. NFTs seem really well built to maintain an authenticated chain of information that doesn't require the creation or monitoring of large-scale institutions like states or corporations. If you know what NFTs are, you have seen them. The culture has imposed them on you. If you've ever used a Bitcoin, well, Bitcoins are so expensive. If you've ever used a fraction of a Bitcoin, then you've engaged in the blockchain somehow. They're unique tokens that they use a transparent, dependent-only decentralized public ledger. That is the blockchain. It's constantly being maintained and verified by individual users. And so in a sense, it has a kind of stability to it that's really powerful. This is my favorite NFT. It's an artwork that's known as Everydays. It was made by an artist named Beeples. The reason I'm showing it to you is because, at least as of now, it's the largest, it was the largest sale of an NFT artwork in history. It's about 70 million US dollars was recently paid for Beeples Everydays. If you know what NFTs are, you know that you don't buy the artwork, you buy a certain access to a location on a blockchain with it. And so NFTs are interesting because they are very, very stable. They're built to be stable, but they're not sticky, right? In fact, the sale of Everydays is an example of that, the fact that they're not sticky. They're tradable. I can give somebody else access to my key that gives and now they own the particular NFT. So although it could be very, very useful to have a stable form of identity, it doesn't seem built to answer this question about identity verification and re-identification. And if you try to make NFTs more sticky, it requires now the creation of some kind of centralized institution, right? Some kind of bank or crypto bank that keeps track of identities. And now we've reintroduced the security issue. Another option that we thought about for a while, and I like this option a lot, but it's got its own issues. There's a lot of interesting research going on right now. It's interesting, but also really scary about de-anonymizing data, right? So take somebody's, take a pattern of completely anonymous online social activity, and you stand a good chance of actually figuring out who that individual is, even if you don't have any individual access. Like, it's completely anonymous data. And this is because the internet is large, but the slice of it that we interact with on any given day is actually quite small, right? We really tend to visit a very small number of websites. We interact with a very small number of people. And so even if that data is fully anonymized, it can actually lead back to you in fairly reliable ways. So our own correlated patterns of activity could be used to verify our identities. These are things that we generate, right? So in some sense, they express us. That seems like an advantage over biomarkers. There's interesting research out of Stanford here, the Bailenson lab. They can re-identify individuals from haptic data. So 5 minutes of motion data from a VR headset, the handsets and the headset, and that's it. No tie to an individual at all. And they with 95% confidence will identify you. That's your pattern of movements. So correlated patterns of activity really could be used to settle this question about identity in the metaverse. It's very, very sticky. Interestingly, it's sticky, but it's not stable. That's its problem. When people who use incognito mode on their surfing, right, are probably engaging in patterns that don't correlate well with their non-incognito patterns. Your particular patterns of activity 5 years ago, 10 years ago, probably wouldn't identify you today. And if you know that correlated patterns of activity are going to be used to track your identity across metaverse spaces, it's very easy to subvert that, right? To just alter your patterns so that you become somebody else. It's not clear how we can settle that problem. And again, I don't know exactly how to settle the re-identification problem. The last thing I'll mention briefly is because extended reality bodies are not limited in the way that physical bodies are, then it becomes very difficult to figure out whether the agents we're interacting with in any given space are human agents or human-like agents. If the internet brought this to you, this was a South Korean television show. This woman's daughter tragically died, and they recreated her in virtual reality so she could have a kind of therapeutic experience with her. So you have a human interacting with a human-like agent, and many people really seem deeply concerned with understanding and knowing whether the agent they're interacting with is human or not, right? And I'm going to try and play an actual video with audio here. If you saw this already, you know where this is going. This was a tech demo a few years back of Google. This is Sundar Pichai announcing the Google Assistant product. It's only about a minute long. Let's hope it plays.
We think AI can help with this problem. So let's go back to this example. Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like, what service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now? Okay, we have at 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay, perfect. So I will see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd. Okay, great. Thanks. Great. Have a great day then.
So in this case, if you remember this particular demo, that it made the rounds in certain parts of sort of tech ethics circles, right? Because this seems like a human-like agent that is explicitly built to deceive people, right? Its function is to make humans treated as human, and for at least the sort of deontologically oriented tech ethicists, this seemed like a major problem, right? That it was using other humans as a mere means. And that it may, in these ways, make itself ripe for manipulation. And just recently, right? So these are months old now, these stories. Specific kind of limited tests with GPT-4, where they allowed it to access parts of the internet to see whether it would be capable of self-motivated behavior, show us that this concern really isn't as abstract as it seemed to be. So in this case, GPT-4 was prevented from accessing some information because CAPTCHAs, right? You've done CAPTCHAs, you know what they look like. Pick the school buses or just click here, right? They're intended to keep bots from accessing that information. And so it texted a worker claiming to be visually impaired so that it would solve the CAPTCHA for it. And in this case, the worker mistook it for a human and helped it in its task. So if we care about differentiating humans from non-humans, we can't rely on the psychological and neurological mechanisms we use in physical spaces. We need some other way of doing that. But human-like agents can be embodied just like human agents in these spaces. They can also have NFT key access, right? They can generate their own correlator patterns of activity. So it becomes difficult to say how we ought to separate the human from the non-human in such spaces. The only idea, this is genuinely, we struggle to think of a good answer here, is actually to rely on biomarkers again, though non-identifying biomarkers, right? So if you have a device that just can measure whether you have a pulse, right? Do you have a pulse? Then you're marked as human, right? If you don't have a pulse, then you're a human-like agent. And that then requires deception on the part of human-like agents. If they want to pass off as human, they need to have a false pulse, right? But in this case, something like this could be used, right? Just a kind of thin conception of biomarkers wouldn't be committing itself to the kinds of assumptions I talked about with issue 2. But genuinely, we're not exactly sure how best to think about this question about separating humans from non-humans, or even whether people in the future will care as much as we do about this particular distinction. It seems clearer to me that we will definitely care about extended reality bodies. It seems clear that we'll want some way of controlling those bodies. It's not clear how, and we'll need some ways of re-identifying each other across those spaces. But in other work, and will be the last thing I say, in other work we published earlier this year, we were thinking about extended reality embodiment in terms of how it might create conditions for unique forms of harassment, so sexual harassment specifically, because extended reality bodies just aren't like physical bodies, and because certain psychological features make us react in fairly realistic ways to certain kinds of digital interactions or mediated interactions. Forms of harassment are, I think, interesting and unregulated right now, because they, in the same way that we had to kind of create a framework to translate concepts like stalking to make sense of cyber stalking, there's a similar kind of translation that needs to happen, I think, for extended reality spaces like these, given the unique features of extended reality embodiment. But that's all I'll say for now. I want to thank you again for having me, and I'm curious to see what people want to follow up on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Eric. That was extremely rich. We've got a bit of time for questions now, folks. Usual rule, please, you can raise your hand in the in the screen if you want, or you can send me through a queue in the private chat if you'd like me to run the queue that way. If you want to follow up on a question that's being asked, then send me a private chat saying that you want to do that as well, and I'll run things that way. Anyway, we're open for questions, folks.
And I'm realizing just now you get to see the sunrise create strange shadows on my face, but I can't do much about that.
Yeah, that's very evocative, Eric. I have a question from Alexander.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very, very interesting. So I was wondering, maybe I missed something, but regarding the third issue that you mentioned about how to reliably differentiate humans and non-human agents, I feel like there are discussions right now about when we are talking about AR specifically, it's very important to know whether the object we're interacting with is virtual or non-virtual. Mm-hmm. And I feel that why not building something like that, like systematically, such that like any non-human agent is marked overtly as such, like, maybe with a stamp or something. I'm not sure you mentioned that, so I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think the concern that I would have there is that requires some central authority to do that, right? Or to at least enforce this. With respect to digital objects, and even more specifically, virtual embodiment, I think that becomes more complicated because we're all going to be digital objects, or at least many of us will choose to exist in this blended capacity in those spaces. And so it's less clear to me how we would mark somebody who chooses to, if I have two color changing mists that I'm talking to, because that's how people are choosing to embody themselves in these particular spaces. And I'm moving from one space to the next, right? Unless there's a central spot that's keeping track of the human and the non-human, it's going to be difficult to create this framework. But you're exactly right. I mean, I think there are ways in which these issues can be connected. So if you're okay with having a kind of central place that keeps track of people who move across the metaverse spaces, right? Who are in Horizon worlds today, but maybe VR chat now, and maybe some other space, and we can verify identity through this central space, then you can also solve the human non-human problem through this central space. Part of what we were trying to explore was, can we avoid that because of the concerns that are raised with keeping this information in these kind of centralized areas? But you're right, that would be one way of collapsing the second and third, and And then it would be a question of what we're using to keep track of the human and the non-human.
Wonderful. So I have a follow-up on this from Neil, and then questions from Sylvie and Fiona. So you first, Neil.
Yeah, so I think there are two. I just want to distinguish two things and just check I've got you right on them. So we've got what I thought Alexandra was first asking was, how do we tell like real people from virtual people, right, at all, right? At which point I think what you've got is the same sort of problem we might get systematically with virtual entities when it's ambiguous whether or not what we're looking at in a given scene when it's good enough is virtual or not virtual. And you seem to be concerned that there would be some sort of central authority would need to impose itself on that. So I don't think that's right. So I'll say about that in a wee second. And then the second thing, which I think you might be right about, which is that we're going to need some sort of governing mechanism. It might not be a governing entity, but it might be a governing mechanism like blockchain attempts to be, in order to try and verify the identity of any given virtual representation to different mists or whatever, right? So those are two different questions, right? But have I characterized your view on each properly?
I think that seems right, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think I disagree on the first one where I think, and I've pitched this for quite a while, so I'll just use the chance to say it again, that I think that if the right organizations, and Apple are the primary one, but the right organizations set a way by which this is done where it looks wonderful and doesn't inhibit the functionality, then what they do is they set a norm. They probably set it strongly enough that deviation from the norm becomes fraud. Right, so if you can get enough people to follow a particular way by which we do things, then you don't need to legislate for that in each different organization, in each different jurisdiction. What you get is the blanket benefit of there being a strong enough norm that anyone that deviates from it is up to no good. And I think that needs a lot of work. It needs done early, and they did not launch it the other day. So I'm concerned that we might have missed the boat on it. But that would solve the problem, right? So if every virtual entity in an augmented reality experience marked itself as such by a strong enough norm, we wouldn't need external or centralized governing force imposing that, right?
That makes sense. Interesting. This is interesting. Yeah, this is connected to we had thought about something like this, not for this issue, but connected to how we solve issues of sexual harassment, right? That like what we really need is changes of both at the sort of professional organizations need to set norms, right? That wouldn't be legislative, and then also social norms so that we can avoid certain kinds of behavior. And I hear you proposing something similar, though. You know, there are other ways of I think jumping on the idea that you're proposing. You know, when we were thinking of this sort of thin biomarker, this could be built just by capitalist agreement, right? Corporations could agree that the devices we use to access these spaces to create these overlays require a measure of like the device measures your pulse at your temples. Most of them can do this already, right? So that it looks for a non-identifying biomarker, and that if so, then you're just marked as a human agent in these spaces. That would be a way to do it. And then the question is, what do you do with people who don't do that?
Yeah, I agree. That's where the question is. I'm maybe more hopeful about the automation of the mechanism or something. Yeah,
putting that kind of pressure at the level of professional ethics, right? Maybe would be a way of influencing the development of these technologies without requiring the complicated sort of international legal issues that a system of enforcement would need if you're going to do this in terms of regulation. Yeah.
Super. Sylvie, you're next.
Thanks. I really learned a lot from this talk, Eric. It was fascinating. You were talking about sexual harassment, and I had this question in my mind. So a long time ago, I worked with people in VR, like really long time ago now. And you probably know, months later, they developed in Spain this experiment that was targeted at precisely people who were convicted of sexual harassment, who had a choice between a rehabilitation kind of experimental program where they were embodying a woman who was being harassed, I think, if I get it correctly, or they could go through the normal community service route. And from what I remember, because this was a long time ago, the people who undertook the experiment where they embodied a woman being harassed, I mean, the recidivism rate was much lower compared to people who had done the traditional, I think it was community service, I'm not sure. Anyway, I was fascinated by that, because then we talked a lot about, you know, there were also these experiments where people embodied rats for like, I don't know how long, but then when they came out of the virtual reality, they were, you know, for instance, our norms about normal space between people. People started behaving more like rats in terms of spaces that they kept between people. And I thought that was fascinating. And I don't know, I just listening to you, I was thinking, because for me, in the back of my mind, these kinds of experiments raise really important ethical concerns too about, given the power of these embodiment experiments, you know, they could be used precisely with a kind of formatting. You know, if the state gets its hands on these kinds of technology to precisely, in this case, it's supposed to be curing or at least addressing a tendency to harass, right? But while it might seem wonderful to reduce recidivism, it's quite worrying when you see the power of this in all sorts of contexts. So I was wondering what you think about that.
So these are good concerns. I was putting, as you were talking, I was putting relevant research, or research I thought was relevant to the question. I think there are a couple of things I can try to say in response. The first is a very quick thing, and if people want to follow up, I'm happy to. But I'm extremely skeptical, not of the empirical results, but of what's happening when we engage in that sort of body transfer experience. It's often spoken of in terms of empathy enhancement, right, or something like that. And I think there are lots of reasons why that's not what's happening, and lots of reasons why we should be worried about using these as nudges to change behavior. But put that concern aside. I think it's absolutely true that it can change behavior, at least in the short term. Right, you can get people to behave like rats, right? You can get people to eat less meat, right? This is Jun Sion had this great study where she embodied people as cows, right? And they ate less meat as a result. So what do we make of this? I think you're right that when states can control embodiment, and in fact, it's not even just embodiment, when they can control features of our environment, then it's really difficult to draw, and this is also true for corporations, but it's really difficult to figure out whether the way that we choose to experience the world is being impacted and controlled by other entities. If you're familiar with Michael Mattery's work on perception in virtual reality, he's really worried about these kinds of things, right? He thinks states or corporations can actually come to shape our values through the way we are mediated by technology. And so in this way, it could seriously undermine individual autonomy. It could seriously undermine our ability to set our own sort of, ends and paths for ourselves. So I think I agree with him that these are genuine concerns, and they're concerns that exist in physical spaces too, right? I mean, the way that advertisements and built environments can influence us in this way is similar, but the way we can control these mediated augmented reality spaces is just so much more personalized that the way that we can manipulate people can be really quite tailored and powerful. So I think I'm just saying I agree with you, but in a very long-winded way.
Good. I would love to see the paper you just mentioned from, sorry, I forgot the name you mentioned.
Michael Mattery, yes.
Yes.
Happy, I will link it in just a moment.
Thank you, that's great. That's fantastic.
We have time, I think, just for one more from Fiona.
Thanks, Ben. So it struck me how surprisingly similar some of the issues of identity in XR are to issues of identity in non-XR. And that made me wonder whether you were maybe a little bit more dismissive of some of the solutions you proposed. Maybe these are just things that we can't really get away with. So let me give you two examples. One of the things you considered was, you know, who should have control over how people appear in XR spaces? And the first thing you considered was, well, should users control how they appear to others? And you sort of worried about that because you said, well, there's room for abuse. I could appear as your abuser and so on. Of course, in everyday reality, we think that people should have control to the extent that we're able over our appearance. And of course, there's that room for abuse. You know, I could dress up as a policeman and try and you know, act as someone I'm not and so on. But that consideration doesn't usually in everyday life make us think that we shouldn't have control over our appearance. So I kind of wondered why that led you to dismiss that option as quickly as you did in the XR case. And then thinking about can we get away from using the body to identify people? You said, well, what about something like non-fungible tokens? I myself was thinking about ORCID IDs for researchers. And you kind of said, you know, one of the big worries about that is security issues. Well, of course, but we do have security issues all the time in terms of passports. And I'm not sure anyone's tried to steal anyone's ORCID yet, but, you know, maybe one day. So, you know, yeah, of course, there are security issues. There are always going to be security issues. It just doesn't seem like that, though, necessarily undermines that as a kind of good solution. We just need to build in security as much as possible and so on.
Right, and I think you're right about both of those. So I wasn't meaning to dismiss the first option in a sort of knockdown way. It was really the advantage, right, is it's a really natural answer. We already control our own physical embodiment. And so why not just give users control over extended reality embodiment, right? I mean, it's to import, this is what so maybe this is not a Mills trap, I don't know. It's to import the norms that are used to govern embodiment in physical spaces into extended reality spaces. The concern I was raising there was about the differences between physical and extended reality embodiment. And so it's the differences that allow for a greater variety or forms of deception and manipulation and harm that make it the case that simply just giving users, in a way, unmitigated control over embodiment opens us up to deception and harm in ways that are much harder to do in physical spaces. You're right that I could do a lot to harass people with my own physical embodiment, including changing how I look, right, and so on. I can just put on blackface, right? I can do that, but the ability to do so in a way that's indistinguishable from a genuine person in this way, that would bear no resemblance to me, is what makes it challenging, right? In the sense that you know, even if I change my physical form pretty substantially, especially if you know me, right? If we're strangers, then kind of anything goes in any space. But if you know me, you're probably going to be able to reliably pick me out, right? Even if I put on a costume, the sound of my voice, as I said, the way that I might move around or talk or deal with you, it's going to be difficult to carry on a deception in that way in physical spaces for too long. Easy in any XR space, right? Just because embodiment is so unlimited. And so it may very well be the option that we choose, just like, for example, maybe biomarkers just are what we have to use for re-identification, but it's going to come with issues that need some mitigation, right? Like we're going to need to find a way to mitigate those potential harms if users are going to be in control over their embodiment.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Eric. I just we'll take a short break now, but before we do so, I'd like us to thank Eric again for a really interesting presentation.